Now let's look at the second question we wanted to answer together. So we want I sorry. Uh look for so now that we're aware of how political history has changed, the next thing we want to do is look for samples. And we'll put this over here, right? We want to look for sample models of analysis to check if we can actually apply them. And you'll remember this is something we studied in module 2. Okay. So ilagay lang natin na that's module 1, that's module 2, right? So in module 2, um there were three. Okay, so we have international models and we have local or Philippine models. And I asked the class earlier why they think we should study international models alongside Philippine models. And your classmates very ably answered na there are actually tendencies in international developments that end up affecting us. And to demonstrate this, we chose one international model and we tried to explain how it affected a local model, or how it not necessarily just affected, but it paralleled, it developed alongside similar ideas that were brewing in the Philippines more or less within the same time period. No? Okay, so let's see. Okay, so the first model, and we'll label this as an international model sample, is the Cornell School. So the Cornell School's mode of analysis, which is third way history, no? Analysis. Yan na lang. Sige. So ayusin natin to. So let's talk about Cornell School's third way analysis. So on the board together, we tried to think about what the third way was about exactly. So think about it right now. What terms come to mind when we say third way history? So there are I started with sige, we'll go through the same process of explanation that I went through earlier. And that is, we need to understand the context first of Cornell's area studies. So either in the 50s or the 60s, lumabas yung Cornell School parang Southeast Asian program. And they specifically wanted to study Southeast Asia, of course, as an area. But before we get to that, we need to understand the context in which this happened. So to do that, we need to look at the World War II context. Alam niyo naman, we're history majors, so we constantly have to be thinking about the context for one thing or the context for another thing. So in the World War II context, we have, let's see, a problem. And the problem is new nation states want to assert their identity apart from, okay, as independent entities. You get what I mean? So if you're not too familiar with World War II and the history of the world or global history during the 1950s, what happened was many former colonies were now released, whether by revolution or because the old colonizers could no longer afford to keep them because of the losses of colonization. No? So this is a long process. It begins in our case, diba? It kind of begins in 1898, but we don't really fully gain independence yet then. And it's a continuing process up until 1946. So this happens in the case of other countries as well. So, yun. Now, new nation states want to assert their identity as independent entities. Question: how do they do this? Now, there are many ways in which through which independent nation states did this, but for us as history majors, the important way is through history, by writing their histories of civilization. Right. Okay. So if you remember, there was something called the grand narrative in the writing of history as a whole, where the assumption of Western models is that, every civilization, if there is a civilization to emerge, every civilization will take on a similar path. And that similar path would look like Western civilization. And how would we plot that out? There are different thinkers who are civilizational thinkers, really. But first, you have one of the markers of a developed nation state is whatever happens in your past, you have to eventually have a independent modern nation state that is able to participate in the global parang context of nation states, right? So you have to write a history that leads up to, that justifies the existence of your nation state by writing about their pasts in a way that would logically lead to the emergence of modernity in the form of the nation state. Yeah? So it was a way for them to assert their identity. Okay, so how were they writing these forms of history? How did they write history then? Now, initially, there were two dominant ways that you find this kind of writing emerging. First, or first way, by using the colonial past as a source of civilization. And you find this in the writings of colonialists, colonial colonial history, right? Okay, so that's the first way, really. And some people like in India, you do see this tendency quite a bit where new nationalists, they called themselves nationalists, but they were also saying that their independence and the status of their civilization, a lot of that came from the fact of colonization and how they were an important part of that empire. Now, the second way was called nationalist. So mm, sometimes this is labeled as pro-Asian. In the case of Southeast Asia, na, pro-Asian nationalist, and they were saying basically that uh, colonization did not have any good things contribute, or in a way, they're trying to forget the colonial past or remember it as purely destructive. Yeah. So the second way, the pro-Asian nationalist way, was to either forget the colonial past, to write less about it, or to remember it as purely destructive. Now, there are, how do we say this? It's not that colonization did not have destructive tendencies. We know full well that it decimated ecosystems as well as communities, and it also created a certain structure of power that we're still trying to undo today, diba? Pero there are some facts of colonization that contribute to the emergence of certain states. For instance, in the Philippines, if we had not been colonized by the Spanish, or if they had not drawn the map to include Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, we might only be Luzon, right? And that might be its own country entirely. So the territoriality of the Philippines, how we imagine the space, is something that in the present really was a product of our colonial experiences. And the word celebrate is polarizing. It's not that we're trying to celebrate these things, we're simply trying to uncover the facts of history and why we understand ourselves culturally, economically, and politically in the way that we do today. And many of those roots lie in our colonial past. So, sabi ng Cornell historians, first way is definitely out of the picture. It has colonial bias. Second way is also out of the picture because it has anti-colonial bias. Um, has colonial bias. And then this one has national bias. So the obsession with, like pro-Asian nationalist history was to always justify the existence of the state. Need to justify existence of the state even if their were people who did not fit neatly into the state. You get what I mean? For instance, in the case of the Philippines, when we were made independent from the United States, the sultans of the South, um, actually, throughout the American colonial period, there were some documents that said some sultans would much rather be under the Americans than under the Philippines. In fact, when Nur Miswari, who was one of the people behind he's a polarizing figure, but he was a key figure behind the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And he was someone who helped define the Bangsamoro identity. Anyway, so when this guy was talking about their history in the south of the Philippines, he said they were victims of something called Philippine colonization or Philippine imperialism, which is fascinating, diba? Because we often think of ourselves as a place that was colonized, not necessarily as a place that colonized, right? But there are some narratives that don't fit neatly into that state. Histories that did not fall into this uh, parang pattern, this narrative were not written about or misrepresented. Yeah, which is problematic, right? Because now, because of the national bias, because you're trying to say the nation exists um, as a coherent entity, because you're trying to justify that. There are some narratives that either you forget or you willfully don't talk about, which is also problematic. And so, the response of Cornell then was to look for a different approach. So kaya ito yung third way na sinasabi nila. The third way is to release ourselves from the obsession with justifying empire or justifying nationhood, and instead look at historical developments as they were. So, for instance, you know how we have this tendency to think about the Spanish colonial period as purely bad, right? And therefore, no native in their right mind who were part of resistant groups would create pacts with them, diba? So often, ang first impression natin ay during the Spanish colonial period, the indigenous people of today did not create pacts, did not transact with them to remain uncolonized. Or we say the Islamic people of the South continued to resist and build their own empires while constantly fighting the Spanish. But in reality, there were moments where uh, the Magindanaoans, for instance, would call for the Cotabato Sultanate would call for help from the Spanish in fighting the Sultanate of Sulu. Diba? And there were cases where the Lumad would actually team up and protect some Recoleto friars. And these are things that are documented on the ground. And they're not revisionist, they actually exist in documents. And they've been triangulated by other historians who have looked at these narratives and they say, okay, how do we fit the fact that some natives accepted and loved and were friends with the Spanish into our concept of nationhood? If some people did not resist, does that mean the fact of our nationalism is invalid? So of course there are many questions related to that, and it's a debate all in itself. But the fact that these kinds of narratives exist makes us ask, how do we make sense of them? And the answer was, forget about empire, forget about nation, use a different standard, use a different geographic scope, the region, and look for similarities between countries, between areas. So that's economic, political, cultural, social, right? Cult, cultural, and social. Yeah. Okay. And this is called area studies. Yeah? Okay. So that is what the Cornell School contributes to us. Well, there are many other things, of course, but the fact that we're looking at the Philippines, for instance, in the context of our Southeast Asian customs, languages, even political and economic connections, such as in the case of the Sulu Sultanate, which we'll learn about later, it helps us be less obsessed with justifying the nation. So, in a way, no, it's almost the first way is almost colonial propaganda contains, and this contains national propaganda. And you kind of understand why they were doing that, right? Because in the post war period, there were many threats to emergent states. In the case of the Philippines, the Hook Rebellion, which started in 1946, threatened to tear the Philippines apart and create an entirely new system in its place. Diba? So, anyway, we'll get there if we get there sa part 3 ng course na to. But, you know. So, that's what the Cornell people wanted to do. Okay. So, that's how we connect the third way analysis to its World War II context.